The great chamber of the Galactic Senate stretched upward into darkness. Its curved walls, lined with thousands of seats, carved from stone older than most civilizations in the known universe. Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood alone at the center of it all. Her boots planted firmly on the petitioner's platform, a simple circle of white light surrounded by shadows and the watching eyes of 100 different species. She was small by galactic standards, barely reaching the chest of the shortest delegate present. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and she wore the simple gray uniform of Earth's diplomatic corps. No medals decorated her chest, no symbols of rank or power. She looked exactly like what the Senate believed her to be, a representative of a young and insignificant species, begging for scraps from the table of their betters. The Veilith delegate sat directly above her, his crystalline body catching the dim light and scattering it into rainbow patterns across the chamber walls. He was ancient beyond human comprehension, his species having achieved spaceflight when humanity's ancestors still lived in trees. His voice rang out like struck glass when he spoke. The Senate recognizes the representative from the human territories, he announced, and Alana could hear the amusement hidden beneath his formal tone. You may present your petition. Elena activated the holographic display built into her wrist device. Images flickered to life around her, images that made her stomach turn, even though she had reviewed them 1,000 times. Colony worlds burning. Cities reduced to ash. Ships torn apart in the void of space. Honored delegates of the Concordat, she began, keeping her voice steady through sheer force of will. 12 days ago, an unknown hostile force emerged from dark space and attacked the human colony of New Helsinki. The attack lasted 4 hours. When it ended, 1.2 million people were dead. She paused to let the numbers sink in, though she could already see the disinterest on many faces. 1 million dead meant nothing to species that counted their populations in the trillions. 6 days later, the same force struck our colony on Meridian Prime. The population there was larger, nearly 2 million souls. None survived. The enemy did not take prisoners, did not attempt communication, did not respond to any signal we sent. They simply killed everyone and consumed the planetary resources before vanishing back into dark space. The holographic images shifted, showing the enemy vessels. They were organic in nature, their hulls made of something that looked like black chitin and pulsing red tissue. They moved through space like living creatures, and their weapons were biological horrors that melted through human armor like acid through paper. We have designated this threat the Harrow Swarm, Elena continued. Our analysis suggests they are a nomadic predator species that strips worlds of all useful material before moving on. Based on their trajectory and speed, we believe they will strike again within 60 days, this time at our core worlds. She took a breath and looked up at the assembled delegates. The human species requests military assistance from the Galactic Concordat. We ask for ships, weapons, and tactical support to defend our remaining colonies. In return, we offer full partnership in the Concordat, access to our research facilities, and our eternal gratitude. Silence fell over the chamber. Elena waited, her heart pounding in her chest. She had practiced this speech 100 times, had prepared answers for every possible question, had studied the political dynamics of the Senate for months. She was ready. What she was not ready for was laughter. It started with the Veilith delegate, a high, ringing sound like wind chimes in a storm. Then the Kreth joined in, their insectoid mandibles clicking together in rapid patterns that served as their species' version of amusement. The Omnith, beings of living gas contained in environmental suits, pulsed with bright colors that Elena's translator identified as condescending mirth. Even the Dothari massive six-limbed beings, who had traded peacefully with humanity for decades, turned their heavy heads away as if embarrassed to witness this display. Ambassador Vasquez, the Valeth delegate said when the laughter had died down. Your species has been traveling among the stars for how long now? 80 of your years? 90? 82 years, Elena replied, keeping her voice neutral. 82 years. The Valeth repeated. My species has been spacefaring for 600,000 years. The Kreth have sailed the void for longer still. And in all that time, do you know what we have learned? Elena said nothing. We have learned that the universe is dangerous, the Valeth continued. We have learned that young species expand too quickly, settle worlds they cannot defend, and then cry out in surprise when predators find them. This is not tragedy, Ambassador. This is natural selection. This is the universe teaching your species a lesson you should have learned before leaving your homeworld. The Kreth delegate leaned forward, his compound eyes glittering. The Concordat does not interfere with ecological corrections. Your colonies were weak, so they were consumed. This is the way of things. 3 million people are dead, Elena said quietly. Children were among them. Families who wanted nothing more than to build new lives on new worlds. Then perhaps your species should have built better defenses instead of better nurseries, the Omnath delegate pulsed. We cannot protect every foolish young race that stumbles into the darkness and finds it full of teeth. A Dothary delegate one Elena had met before, had shared meals with, had considered something close to a friend raised his massive hand. I move that the human petition be classified as a regional concern, not requiring Concordat intervention. Seconded, the Valeth said immediately. Elena felt something cold settle in her chest. You would let us die? All of us? Every human in the galaxy? We would let nature take its course, the Valeth replied. If your species survives, you will be stronger for it. If you do not survive, then you were never meant to be part of the galactic community. Either outcome is acceptable to the Concordat. The vote was called. It passed with an overwhelming majority. Only 3 delegates voted against it, and their objections were noted and dismissed within seconds. Elena stood in her circle of light, surrounded by beings who had just signed the death warrant of her entire species. She watched them congratulate themselves on their wisdom, watched them turn to other business as if 3 million dead humans were nothing more than a minor footnote in the day's proceedings. And something inside her went very, very quiet. The Valeth delegate looked down at her with what might have been pity. You may go now, Ambassador. We wish your species the best of luck in its upcoming trials. Elena looked up at him. Her face showed nothing, not anger, not despair, not even disappointment. Her eyes were as empty as the void between stars. She opened her mouth, and the chamber fell silent, waiting for the outburst they knew would come. Humans were emotional creatures, after all, primitive and passionate. Surely this one would scream, or weep, or make threats she could not possibly keep. Elena closed her mouth without saying a word. Then she bowed once, slowly, deeply to the full Senate. And then she turned and walked away. Her footsteps echoed through the chamber, steady and unhurried. Every delegate watched her go, waiting for her to turn back, to make one final plea, to show some sign of the desperation they expected. She never looked back. The great doors of the Senate chamber closed behind her with a sound like a tomb being sealed. The Valeth delegate laughed again. How disappointing. I expected at least some tears. But in the highest seats of the chamber, where the eldest observers sat in eternal silence, something stirred. The Ohani observer of being so old that she remembered when the Valeth themselves were young and foolish watched the doors through which the human had departed. And for the first time in 10,000 years, she felt the cold touch of fear. The news spread through the galaxy like fire through dry grass. Within hours of Ambassador Vasquez's departure, every major news network was broadcasting the story. Humans denied aid by Concordat, the headlines read. young species left to face extinction alone. Some networks played the footage with sympathy, showing the burning colonies and the desperate faces of human refugees. Others treated it as entertainment, mocking the naive humans who had thought they could ask the elder races for help. Comment sections filled with opinions from 1,000 species, most of them cruel, many of them dismissive, almost none of them kind. On Earth, the reaction was different. There was anger. Yes, a deep and burning fury that filled the streets with protesters and the airwaves with calls for revenge. But beneath the anger, there was something else. Something quieter. Something that had been part of humanity since the first cave dweller looked up at the stars and decided to reach for them. The human government called an emergency session. Every leader from every nation attended, either in person or through holographic projection. They gathered in the Great Hall of the United Earth Council, and for the first time in human history, there was no arguing. There were no political games. There was only the shared understanding that their species stood at the edge of extinction. President Chen Wei stood at the podium, his face showing the exhaustion of a man who had not slept in days. "We have received the official response from the Galactic Concordat," he announced. "They have classified the Harrow Swarm as a regional concern. They will not send ships. They will not send weapons. They will not send aid of any kind." The hall was silent, not because the delegates were surprised. They had all seen the footage, but because hearing it spoken aloud made it terribly, horribly real. "Ambassador Vasquez has submitted her report," President Chun continued. "She estimates that we have approximately 60 days before the swarm reaches our core systems. If they follow the same pattern as before, they will strike Earth itself within 90 days. A murmur ran through the crowd. Earth, the homeworld, the cradle of humanity, the place where every human traced their ancestry, where the first stories had been told, where their species had taken its first steps toward the stars. "We have options," the president said. "We can attempt to negotiate with the swarm, though Ambassador Vasquez believes this is unlikely to succeed. We can attempt to flee, to scatter our population across the galaxy and hope that some survive. Or we can fight." He paused, looking out over the assembled leaders. "I will not make this decision alone. This is not a choice for one nation or one government. This is a choice for all of humanity. What do we do?" The debate lasted 3 days. Representatives from every nation spoke, offering opinions, ideas, fears, and hopes. Some argued for flight better to survive as scattered refugees than to die as a united species. Others argued for negotiation. Perhaps the swarm could be reasoned with, bribed, or redirected. But in the end, the vote was nearly unanimous. Humanity would fight, not because they believed they could win, but because running was not in their nature, because surrender was not in their blood, because if their species was going to die, they would die standing up, facing the darkness with weapons in their hands. The first week after the decision was chaos. Factories that had been producing consumer goods were converted to military production overnight. Scientists abandoned their research projects and turned their minds to weapons and shields and engines. Every able-bodied adult was offered a place in the new military, and the recruitment offices were overwhelmed with volunteers. Ambassador Vasquez returned from Axiom Prime and was immediately placed in charge of intelligence operations. Her experience with the Concordat made her invaluable, but more than that, her silence in the Senate had become a symbol. The footage of her walking away without a word was played again and again, and people began to call her the Silent Ambassador. She did not like the name, but she understood its power. In a galaxy where humans were considered emotional and primitive, her silence had been shocking. It had shown a different side of humanity, a cold, controlled, calculating side that the elder races had not expected. "They think we will come back," Elena said during a briefing with the president. They think we will beg again, or threaten, or try to negotiate. They are waiting for us to prove that we are exactly what they believe us to be. What do they believe we are? The president asked. Children, Elena replied. Clever children, perhaps, but children nonetheless. Emotional, short-sighted, incapable of true long-term planning. They believe we will rage and cry and eventually accept our fate. Then we will prove them wrong. The second week brought more bad news. Deep space sensors detected the Harrow swarm gathering at the edge of human territory. There were more of them, now hundreds of bioships where before there had been dozens. They were preparing for a massive assault, and humanity had nowhere near enough ships to stop them. But the bad news also brought unexpected hope. Mining companies reported that their operations had increased production by 300%. Shipyards announced that they had developed new construction techniques that could build warships in weeks instead of months. Research labs unveiled prototype weapons that used principles the Concordat had considered impossible. Humanity was not waiting to die. They were preparing to fight back with everything they had. The third week brought a strange quiet. The factories were running at full capacity, but the streets were empty. The news networks had stopped broadcasting panic and had started broadcasting calm, measured updates. People went about their daily lives with a strange serenity, as if they had all accepted what was coming and had decided to face it with dignity. In the Concordat, this silence was misinterpreted. The Valith delegate gave a speech about how humans were retreating into primitive grief rituals and would emerge eventually, humbled and ready to accept their place in the galaxy. The Kreth sent a formal inquiry asking if humanity needed psychological support to deal with their collective trauma. The inquiries went unanswered. The speeches were ignored. Human ambassadors quietly packed their belongings and left Concordat space without explanation. Trade agreements were allowed to expire without renewal. Communication channels were maintained but rarely used. Ambassador Vasquez oversaw the withdrawal personally. She visited each Concordat station where humans had lived and worked, and she watched as her people left their homes behind. Some of them were angry, cursing the aliens who had abandoned them. Others were sad, grieving for friendships that would never recover. But most of them were quiet. They packed their bags, closed their doors, and walked away without looking back, just as Elena had done in the Senate chamber. On her last day on Axiom Prime, Elena stood at a viewing window and looked out at the vast station. Ships from 100 species came and went, their crews unaware or uncaring that humanity was leaving forever. Life in the Concordat continued as it always had, unchanged by the extinction of one small species. They will notice eventually, said a voice behind her. Elena turned to find the Orhani observer standing in the shadows. The ancient being was smaller than Elena had expected, her body wrapped in robes that hid most of her features. Only her eyes were visible eyes that had seen civilizations rise and fall across countless millennia. Will they? Elena asked. I am not certain they will notice at all. They will notice, the observer said. Perhaps not today, perhaps not tomorrow, but they will notice. And when they do, they will understand what silence truly means. Elena studied the ancient being for a long moment. You knew this would happen, did you not? You knew they would refuse to help us. I knew it was possible. I hoped it would not come to pass. But you did not speak. You did not argue in our favor. The observer was silent for a moment. I am an observer. I do not interfere. But I watch, and I remember, and I learn. And I have learned something today that troubles me greatly. What is that? The observer's ancient eyes met Elena's. I have learned that humans are not what we thought you were. You are something else entirely. Something we have not seen in a very long time. And what is that? But the observer did not answer. She simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the station. Elena watched her go, then turned back to the viewing window. Outside, a human transport ship was departing, its engines glowing blue against the darkness of space. She touched the glass with her fingertips. "We will see each other again," she whispered to the Concordat she was leaving behind. "And when we do, you will finally understand." Then she turned and walked away, ready to begin the next chapter of humanity's story, a chapter that would be written not in words, but in fire. 12 galactic months passed in silence. The Concordat continued its business as it always had, debating trade agreements and territorial disputes and the thousand small concerns that filled the lives of civilizations older than stars. The humans were mentioned occasionally, usually as an example of what happened to species that expanded too quickly, or as the subject of dark humor among delegates who found extinction amusing. The Valith delegate gave regular updates on the human situation to anyone who cared to listen. "Our long-range sensors detect minimal activity in their territory," he reported during one session. "Their fleet remains small, their colonies remain vulnerable, and their communications have ceased almost entirely. It appears they have accepted their fate and are spending their final days in quiet contemplation." The Senate accepted this assessment without question. Why would they doubt it? Humans were a young species, barely out of their cradle. They had no ancient technologies, no hidden reserves, no secret weapons. What could they possibly do against a threat that destroyed civilizations far older and far more powerful? But not everyone was satisfied with the Valith reports. The Dothri Intelligence Service had continued monitoring human space even after the diplomatic withdrawal. Their sensors detected unusual energy signatures coming from the Sol system signatures that matched no known technology. Their analysts reported massive increases in industrial output, far beyond anything humans should have been capable of. "Something is wrong," Admiral Thren reported to the Dothri High Council. "The humans are not behaving like a dying species. Their factory output has increased by 4,000%. Their mining operations have expanded to cover every asteroid belt in their territory. And there is something happening near their largest planet, something our sensors cannot identify." The High Council dismissed his concerns. "They are building monuments," one elder suggested. "Primitive species often construct great works when facing extinction. It gives them comfort to believe they will be remembered." "With respect, Elder, these are not monuments. The energy readings suggest weapons development on a scale we have never seen." "And our probe?" "Your probe malfunctioned," the Elder interrupted. "Sent too deep into human territory, it encountered interference and was lost. There was nothing suspicious about this." Admiral Thren knew when he was being silenced. He bowed to the council and left without further argument. But he did not stop watching. He could not stop watching. Something in his gut told him that the humans were planning something that would change everything. In the Sol system, hidden from prying eyes by jamming fields and sensor ghosts, humanity was indeed planning something. The shipyards orbiting Mars had expanded to cover half the planet's surface. Day and night, automated factories produced components for warships unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Human engineers had thrown away the rulebooks, ignored the established principles of Concordat technology, and started from scratch with designs born from desperation and genius. The first of the new dreadnoughts, christened the Defiant, was completed 4 months after the Senate rejected humanity's petition. It was 3 kilometers long, armed with weapons that could crack planets and shields that could withstand the fury of a star. Its engines could outrun anything in the Concordat fleet, and its sensors could detect a ship jumping into normal space from 1,000 light years away. By the end of the first year, there were 50 dreadnoughts. By the middle of the second year, there were 500. And in the shadow of Jupiter, hidden by the gas giant's massive radiation belts, something even larger was taking shape. They called it the Answered Prayer, a ship so vast that it had its own gravitational pull. It was not a warship in the traditional sense. It was a mobile fortress, a command center, a symbol of everything humanity had become. Its construction required the resources of 3 asteroid belts, the labor of 1,000,000 workers, and the genius of humanity's greatest minds. And it was almost ready. Ambassador Vasquez stood on the observation deck of the Answered Prayer, watching as the final components were fitted into place. She was older now, her hair showing streaks of gray that had not been there before. The past year had aged her, but it had also hardened her. The naive diplomat who had stood before the Senate was gone. In her place stood a woman who had seen her species transform itself through sheer force of will. "Ambassador," a voice called from behind her. "The final weapon systems are online. We are ready." Elena turned to face General Marcus Cole, the commander of humanity's new military. He was a tall man with a scarred face and eyes that had seen too much death. He had lost his family on New Helsinki, his wife, his daughters, his parents, and he had channeled his grief into building the most powerful military force the galaxy had ever known. "What about the Harrow Swarm?" Elena asked. "Where are they now?" "They've been quiet," Marcus replied. "Our scouts report that they are gathering at the edge of Concordat space, building their numbers for a major assault. We estimate they will strike within the next few weeks." "And their target?" "Valith Prime, the crystalline homeworld. It appears they have decided to attack the heart of the Concordat." Elena allowed herself a small, cold smile. "How appropriate. The species that laugh loudest will be the first to scream. Shall we intervene?" It was the question that had haunted Elena for months. Part of her wanted to let the Concordat burn, to watch from a safe distance as the species who had mocked humanity's suffering experienced the same terror, the same helplessness, the same despair. It would be justice. It would be revenge. It would be everything the Valith and their allies deserved. But another part of her remembered why she had become a diplomat in the first place. She remembered the ideals she had believed in, the hope she had carried, the dream of a galaxy where different species worked together instead of against each other. That dream had been shattered in the Senate chamber, but its pieces still lay scattered in her heart. "Not yet," she finally said. "We wait, we watch. And when the time is right, we remind the galaxy what humanity truly is." "And what is that, Ambassador?" Elena looked out at the stars, the same stars that had watched humanity crawl out of the mud, split the atom, and reach for the heavens. The same stars that had witnessed their rejection and their transformation. The same stars that would soon witness their return. "We are the species that refuse to die," she said quietly. "We are the species that built an empire from ashes. We are the species that turned despair into determination and grief into glory. And we are the species that will save this ungrateful galaxy, not because it deserves saving, but because that is who we choose to be." General Cole nodded slowly. "The fleet is ready, Ambassador. 500 dreadnoughts, 10,000 cruisers, 50,000 fighters. Every ship crewed by volunteers who know they might not come home. Every weapon tested and calibrated. Every shield at full power. And the crew? Are they ready to fight for those who abandoned us?" "They are ready to fight for humanity, Ambassador. What happens to the Concordat is secondary. But if saving them proves what we are capable of, then every pilot I know would consider that a worthy bonus." Elena nodded. "Then we wait for the swarm to make its move. And when the Concordat sends its desperate plea for help, we will answer. But we will answer on our terms, in our time, and in our way." She turned from the window and walked toward the bridge, ready to take her place among the leaders of humanity's new military. Behind her, the stars continued to shine cold and distant and eternal, watching, as one small species prepared to change the course of galactic history. The quiet year was ending. The time for silence was almost over. And soon, very soon, the galaxy would learn what happened when you underestimated humanity. The sky above Valeth Prime darkened without warning. One moment, the crystalline world basked in the light of its twin suns, its surface glittering like a sea of diamonds. The next, a shadow fell across the planet, a shadow made of 10,000 ships, each one a nightmare of black chitin and pulsing red tissue. The Harrow Swarm had come. In the capital city of Axiom Primus, the Valeth delegate who had laughed at humanity's plea for help stood frozen at his window. His crystalline body, usually alive with dancing light, had gone dark with terror. He watched as the first bioships descended through the atmosphere, their acid-dripping maws opening wide to consume everything in their path. "Impossible," he whispered. They were supposed to stay in the outer systems. They were supposed to be a regional concern. But the swarm cared nothing for Concordat classifications. They had stripped 100 worlds of life across 1,000,000 years, and they had finally found a target worth their full attention, a planet rich with resources and defenseless against their hunger. The Valeth Defense Fleet launched within minutes, their elegant silver ships rising to meet the enemy. They were among the finest warships in the Concordat, crewed by veterans with thousands of years of experience. Surely they could hold the line until reinforcements arrived. They lasted approximately 47 minutes. The swarm's weapons were unlike anything the Valeth had encountered. Biological projectiles that ate through shields like acid through paper. Tentacles of living matter that wrapped around ships and crushed them like eggs. And worst of all, a kind of psychic scream that paralyzed crews and left them helpless as their vessels were torn apart. By the time the last Valeth ship exploded, the swarm had lost fewer than 100 bioships. The rest continued their descent, spreading across the planet like a plague of locusts. The delegate who had mocked humanity ran through the streets of Axiom Primus, his crystalline feet shattering against the pavement in his haste. Around him, his people screamed and died as the swarm's ground forces poured from landing craft. The creatures were horrifying six-legged monsters with razor-sharp claws and mouths that dripped acid. They killed without mercy, without hesitation, without any emotion that the Valeth could understand. "Help us!" The delegate screamed into his communicator. "Someone help us! The swarm is here. They are killing everyone." His cry was echoed across the galaxy. From the Kreth homeworlds came similar pleas as the swarm struck with coordinated precision. From the Omnath nebulae came distress signals cut short by static as their floating cities were consumed. From the Dothri Fortress worlds came emergency broadcasts that suddenly went silent. The swarm had not come for one species. They had come for all of them. In the Senate chamber on Axiom Prime, the surviving delegates gathered in a state of absolute panic. The great hall that had once been filled with condescending laughter was now filled with desperate shouting. Species that had considered themselves lords of the galaxy now scrambled over each other like frightened animals. "We need reinforcements," the Kreth delegate shrieked. "Send every ship, every weapon, everything we have. There are no reinforcements." Another delegate cried. "The swarm has struck 17 systems simultaneously. Every fleet is engaged. Every reserve has been deployed. We have nothing left." The Valeth delegate, the same one who had stood before the Senate so proudly, who had dismissed humanity's petition with such casual contempt, collapsed into his seat. His crystalline body was cracked and bleeding from his escape, and his voice was barely a whisper. "We are going to die," he said. "All of us. The Concordat will fall, and we will be forgotten, just as we dismissed the humans." The mention of humanity brought a sudden, terrible silence to the chamber. Every delegate remembered the footage, the small human woman walking away without a word, her silence more damning than any curse. Every delegate remembered their own reaction. The laughter, the mockery, the absolute certainty that humans were nothing and would soon be extinct. The humans, someone whispered. What about the humans? Could they help us? They are dead. The Kreth delegates snapped. Or hiding. Or too weak to make any difference. We abandoned them, remember? Why would they lift a finger to save us? But the question had been raised, and desperation made them willing to try anything. A message was hastily composed to plea for assistance, wrapped in diplomatic language that barely concealed the terror behind it. It was transmitted to every human frequency they could identify, broadcast on every channel, repeated again and again in the hope that someone would hear. 3 days passed. The swarm continued its assault, growing stronger with every world it consumed. Valeth Prime was 60% conquered, its glittering cities reduced to empty husks. The Kreth had lost contact with half their colonies. The Omnith were facing extinction. And then, finally, a response came. It arrived on an open channel, broadcast so that every species in the galaxy could hear. A single line of text, delivered in the cold, formal language of human diplomacy. Your request has been received. Deliberations are ongoing. The words hung in the air of the Senate chamber like a death sentence. Deliberations. The humans were deliberating while the galaxy burned. They were discussing and debating and considering while the swarm devoured everything in its path. The Valeth delegate laughed a broken, hysterical sound. They mock us, he said, just as we mocked them. They use our own words against us. Can you blame them? Asked a quiet voice. Everyone turned to see the Orhani observer rising from her seat in the highest tier of the chamber. She descended slowly, her ancient body moving with painful deliberation. When she reached the floor, she stood before the assembled delegates and spoke words that none of them would ever forget. 12 months ago, a human ambassador stood in this very chamber. She showed us the bodies of her people, 3 million dead, burned and broken by the same enemy that now consumes our worlds. She begged us for help, and we laughed. We called her species primitive. We called their deaths natural selection. We told them to accept their fate. She paused, her ancient eyes moving from face to terrified face. And what did she do? She did not scream. She did not threaten. She did not weep. She simply bowed and walked away in silence. That silence was a message, but we were too arrogant to hear it. That silence was a warning, but we were too proud to understand it. What was the message? The Valeth delegate asked. What did she mean? The Orhani observer turned to face him directly. She meant that humanity was done with us. She meant that they would remember what we did and what we refused to do. She meant that when the time came, when the darkness found us as it had found them, we would face it alone, just as they did. But they answered our message. They said deliberations are ongoing. Yes, the observer agreed. They answered with our own words. They are showing us what it feels like to beg for help that may never come. They are teaching us the lesson we taught them. Then we are doomed, the delegate whispered. The observer smiled a small, sad expression that held centuries of wisdom. Perhaps, or perhaps the humans are not like us. Perhaps they will prove that mercy can exist even where justice demands vengeance. We must wait and see. Outside the chamber, the sky continued to darken as more swarm ships arrived. Time was running out for the Concordat, and humanity remained silent. But somewhere in the depths of space, 500 dreadnoughts waited information. Somewhere in the shadow of a distant planet, the answered prayer hummed with power. And somewhere on its bridge, Ambassador Elena Vasquez watched the distress signals flooding in from across the galaxy. They are ready, General Cole said. The fleet awaits your command. Elena nodded slowly. Then let us remind the galaxy that humanity does not forget. But let us also remind them that we are not like them." She took a deep breath and gave the order that would change the course of history. "All ships, jump to Concordat space. Today, we show the universe what mercy looks like." The sky tore open above Axiom Prime. It was not a gentle opening, not the smooth shimmer of a standard jump point. This was a wound in reality itself, a jagged tear that bled light and fire across the void. Through it came ships, human ships, but nothing like what the galaxy had seen before. The dreadnoughts arrived first, their massive forms blocking out the stars. Each one was a fortress of metal and fury, bristling with weapons that glowed with barely contained power. Behind them came the cruisers, smaller but no less deadly, their sleek hulls designed for speed and precision. And finally, swarming like angry hornets, came the fighters' 50,000 vessels piloted by men and women who had volunteered to fight for a galaxy that had abandoned them. At the center of the fleet, emerging from its own tier in space-time, came the answered prayer. It was so vast that observers on the planet's surface could see it without telescopes, a shadow against the stars, a monument to what desperation and genius could create when combined. Its engines alone were the size of small moons, and its weapons arrays stretched for kilometers in every direction. The swarm reacted instantly. Thousands of bioships broke away from their assault on Valith Prime and rose to meet this new threat. Their organic hulls pulsed with hunger as they sensed fresh prey, more resources to consume, more enemies to destroy. They had no idea what they were facing. The first volley from the human fleet was not a conventional weapon. It was something new, something the swarm had never encountered. Concentrated gravity wells that twisted bioships into unrecognizable shapes. Quantum collapse warheads that unmade matter at the molecular level. Targeted radiation bursts that disrupted the biological signals the swarm used to coordinate. In the first 60 seconds of the battle, 300 swarm bioships were destroyed. Not damaged, not disabled, but completely annihilated, reduced to clouds of organic debris that drifted through the void like snow. The swarm, for the first time in its million-year history, hesitated. In the Senate chamber, the delegates watched the battle through holographic displays. They saw human ships dancing through the swarm's formations, their movements impossibly fast and precise. They saw weapons fire that should have been impossible, shields that held against attacks that would have destroyed any Concordat vessel. They saw humans fighting with a cold, calculated fury that made the swarm's mindless hunger look primitive by comparison. How is this possible? The Valith delegate whispered. They were supposed to be weak. They were supposed to be dying. They were supposed to be what we told them they were, the Urhani observer replied. But they refused to accept our judgment. They decided to become something else. The battle raged for 11 hours. The swarm threw everything it had at the human fleet, every bioship, every weapon, every tactic that had served it for millennia. But the humans had prepared for this moment. They had studied the swarm's attacks on their colonies, analyzed every pattern, identified every weakness. And they had built their fleet to exploit those weaknesses with ruthless efficiency. By the 6th hour, the swarm's numbers had been cut in half. By the 9th hour, their remaining ships were attempting to flee. By the 11th hour, the answered prayer fired its main weapon, a beam of pure antimatter that punched through the swarm's mothership and detonated its core. The explosion was visible from the surface of Valith Prime. A new sun bloomed in the sky, bright enough to cast shadows across the crystalline landscape. And when the light faded, the Harrow swarm was gone, not retreated, not scattered, but completely and utterly destroyed. Silence fell over the galaxy. In the Senate chamber, no one moved. The delegates stared at their displays, watching as human ships began cleanup operations, hunting down every last fragment of the swarm. Ensuring that nothing could regenerate, Nothing could escape. Nothing could ever threaten the galaxy again. Then, slowly, a sound began to build. It started as a whisper, a single delegate murmuring words of disbelief. Then another joined, and another, until the chamber was filled with voices. Some were crying. Some were laughing. Some were simply repeating the same words over and over again. They saved us. The humans saved us. 3 days later, Ambassador Elena Vasquez walked into the Senate chamber. She wore the same gray uniform she had worn on her last visit, now decorated with a single medal, a golden star that represented humanity's victory over the swarm. Her face was tired but composed, and her eyes held the same quiet intensity that had unsettled the Orhani observers so long ago. The chamber fell silent as she approached the petitioner's platform. Every delegate remembered what had happened the last time she had stood there. Every delegate remembered their own role in humanity's humiliation. Elena looked up at them, the Valeth who had laughed, the Kreth who had clicked their amusement, the Almeth who had pulsed with condescension. She saw their fear and their shame and their desperate hope, and she felt something unexpected. She felt pity. "Honored delegates of the Concordat," she began, her voice carrying through the silent chamber. 12 months ago, I stood in this place and asked for your help. My people were dying, and I begged you to save them. You refused. You laughed. You told us that our extinction was natural selection." She paused, letting the words sink in. 3 million humans died because of that decision. 3 million of my people, my friends, my family, my fellow citizens burned while you debated whether we deserved to exist. I walked out of this chamber in silence because words could not express what I felt. Rage and grief and a betrayal so deep it left me hollow. The delegate shifted uncomfortably. Some could not meet her eyes. I could have let you burn. When the swarm came for you, I could have watched from a safe distance and called it justice. My people would have understood. Many of them wanted exactly that. They wanted revenge for every laugh, every dismissal, every cruel word spoken in this chamber. She took a breath. But humanity is not defined by what we want. We are defined by what we choose. And we chose not to become what you said we were. We chose not to let 3 million deaths turn us into monsters. We chose to save you, not because you deserved saving, but because mercy is stronger than revenge. Elena reached into her uniform and produced a small data chip. She placed it on the platform where it glowed with a soft blue light. This contains the schematics for our shield technology, our weapon systems, and our faster-than-light drives. We give it to you freely. No conditions. No demands. No payment required. It is a gift, not because we owe you anything, but because we believe the measure of civilization is not how it treats its equals, but how it treats those who wronged it. The chamber was absolutely silent. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. The galaxy mocked us, called us primitive, said we would never survive. And now here we stand, the species that refused to die, the species that saved its tormentors, the species that proved that kindness can exist even in the coldest darkness. She looked up at the Orhani observer, who was watching from her high seat with tears streaming down her ancient face. We do not ask for your gratitude. We do not expect your friendship. We ask only that you remember this moment. Remember what we could have done and what we chose to do instead. And when you encounter the next young species struggling to survive in a hostile universe, remember how you treated us and choose to be better. Elena Vasquez bowed once more to the Senate. Then she turned and walked toward the exit, just as she had done 12 months before. But this time, she was not walking away in defeat. She was walking toward a future where humanity stood among the greatest powers the galaxy had ever known, not because they had conquered, but because they had proven that strength and mercy could exist together. The doors closed behind her. In the silence that followed, the Orhani observer rose from her seat and spoke the words that would be remembered for millennia. "The humans did not conquer the galaxy," she said, her voice heavy with wonder and shame. "They shamed it into becoming worthy of them." And across the stars, from every world that had witnessed humanity's choice, a new understanding began to take root. Some species were powerful because they could destroy, but others were powerful because they chose not to. Humanity had shown them the difference.